Apple just lost one of the most important lawsuits in its history, and it's going to cost them billions. But the real twist? They didn't lose to another tech giant. They lost to a video game company. And somehow, that's just the beginning of their problems. Apple stock is down nearly 20% since December. That's close to $1 trillion in lost value. They're now the weakest performer among the so-called Magnificent Seven. So, what the hell happened? Let's rewind to 2020. Epic Games, the company behind Fortnite, made a bold move. They added a direct payment option inside their iOS app, offering a 20% discount if you skipped Apple's system. Apple immediately pulled Fortnite from the App Store. Epic sued them the same day. This wasn't a surprise move, it was a trap. Epic had been planning this for over a year under a secret campaign called Project Liberty. At the center of all this is the so-called Apple tax. Apple charges up to 30% on every in-app purchase. Doesn't matter if it's a game, a subscription, or just a tip. And developers aren't allowed to link to outside payment methods. You either pay Apple or you're out. Epic CEO Tim Sweeney had been criticizing this model for years. He believed Apple's control over the App Store was a monopoly. And in 2020, he finally took action. The case went to court. And while Apple technically won, the judge ruled they weren't a monopoly. They did lose on a key point. Apple was ordered to allow developers to tell users about other ways to pay. In other words, the no external links rule had to go. But Apple didn't just take the loss and move on. They played dirty. They allowed external payments but slapped a 27% commission on them. They added warning pop-ups that made it sound like users were heading into dangerous territory. You're leaving Apple. We're not responsible for what happens next. Even if it was Netflix or Spotify, this wasn't compliance. It was sabotage. The courts weren't fooled. Judge Yvonne Gonzalez-Rogers wasn't subtle. She said Apple acted in bad faith, called out specific executives for misleading the court, and even referred the matter for potential criminal contempt. Tim Cook himself was named. The judge said he ignored internal advice, backed the finance team's aggressive tactics, and made a deliberate choice to drag this out. 4 years later, Epic finally won. The App Store rules were forced to change, for real this time. No more fake warnings. No more shady fees. Spotify added external payments. Patreon let creators take money directly. Stripe got involved. And Fortnite came back to iOS with its own payment system. It's a win for Epic, but also a win for everyone except Apple. And here's the thing. The lawsuit, that might be the least of Apple's problems right now. Because behind the scenes, their entire supply chain is cracking. 95% of Apple's products are manufactured or assembled in China. Everything from the screen to the processor gets put together there. Apple built an empire on cheap labor, fast logistics, and complete control. But now, the cost of labor in China has doubled. Young workers want better jobs. And Chinese companies like Huawei and Vivo are making high-end phones for less money. Apple dropped to third place in China's smartphone market in 2024. iPhone sales plunged 18%. That's the worst drop they've seen in nearly a decade. Meanwhile, the US and China are knee-deep in a trade war. Trump's back in office and hit Chinese imports with brutal tariffs. 10%, then 20%, then up to 145%. And this time, Apple didn't get a pass. Everything they import from China just got a lot more expensive. And remember, Apple chose this path. Tim Cook, the supposed supply chain genius, built this machine. Now he's stuck inside it. So what's the plan? India. Apple's trying to shift production. In 2024, 14% of iPhones were made in India. That's something, but nowhere near enough. It could take 5 years to match China's volume and at least a decade to match its efficiency. And all this is happening while Apple's product strategy is flailing. iPhone upgrades are feeling stale. Their Apple Intelligence launch in 2025 was a mess. Underwhelming and already behind competitors. For a company that built its brand on innovation, Apple is suddenly looking slow. The bottom line? They got greedy. They locked down their platform, squeezed developers, ignored warnings, and milked the system until the courts and the market pushed back. Now, they're facing the consequences. A historic legal loss, a crumbling supply chain, a shifting global economy, and a user base that's no longer buying the hype. Apple isn't going anywhere tomorrow, but the cracks are very real. And for the first time in a long time, the world's most powerful tech company actually looks vulnerable. We'll see where it goes from here.